Today we're going to go over philosophy, secular humanism, Marxism, Leninism, and postmodernism. And it totally spell check messed that up. Modernism. Today is going to be more informative than really that. I will try to see if I could pinpoint it with some other things as well, maybe a story or two. But the first thing is, what is humanism? Humanism is a naturalistic and rejects supernatural stance with its postulated creator, God, and cosmic ruler. So what we're going to see in these three worldviews is something that's common. First of all, what is the commonality between all three of these worldviews in theology? Yes. Huh? They focus on humans, meaning what? Not so self-centered. Theology. What is theology? The study of religion. So what was their commonality in theology, in their religious beliefs? In Marxism, Leninist, secular humanist, and postmodernist. What was their commonality in how they view religion? Huh? Not entirely different people. Actually, they believe that there's a lack of a certain entity. Lack of God, or what we like to term atheism. A being the Greek word for no, and theism, God, no God. So they believe in no God. There is no God. So humanism is the ideology where humanity is the pinnacle of evolutionary development and also the highest point of anything. So there is no superior being than the human right now, at least of what we know. Because then you start talking about the concept of, is there extraterrestrial life and different things like that we're not going to go over here today. So naturalism, the way that, so we're going to break it up into secular humanist, Marxism, Leninist, and postmodernist. And postmodernist is probably going to be the one that you guys relate to the most, because that's kind of what has been proposed more often in modern day. And we'll go over that once we get there. But first, with secular humanism is naturalism. Naturalism relies solely on the denial of God. In other words, they say there is no God, so henceforth, everything else has to fall in line with that. So when they talk about philosophy, they believe that the origin of the cosmos is, as it states here, the cosmos is all that is or ever was and ever will be. Nature is but an endless series of efficient causes. She, quote unquote, nature, cannot create, but she eternally transforms. There was no beginning, and there will be no end. So in other words, all of the universe has existed, will always exist, and will forever exist, and all it is just one cataclysmic mistake after mistake, after random chance, after random chance, after event after event after event, and it's just constantly just changing, and that's all it does. All knowledge is acquired by the scientific evidence, and their main problem that they have with this mentality and philosophy is the mind-body problem. What is the mind-body problem? We spoke about that when we were talking about philosophy in biblical Christianity. What was the problem with that? The mind. What is mind-body? What is the mind and body situation?
When you die,
we said this like last Wednesday. So you were here.
Mind, body, what?
What is the mind-body issue, problem?
The world is moving to one more area of chaos?
No, that's the second law of thermodynamics. What is the mind-body problem?
mind and body.
Mind-body problem.
Your body dies here, you stay here?
Okay, so that will be a monistic mentality of the mind-body problem. What is the mind-body problem? Then what would that be? We spoke about dualism and monism.
There's nowhere else to go.
Not entirely.
Where's the soul?
Huh?
Were you saying like where's the soul?
Where's the soul? That will be a problem to address. Where's the soul? Where's the conscience? Where's those things? Is the mind separate from the body? Whereas that conscious soul is a separate entity. In other words, we're both supernatural and we are physical. Or is the mind a portion of the brain? In other words, is it just chemical neurons firing off in the head? And that's basically how we get our personality, how we get our conscious, and how we get our soul. And that's the question we must ask. Every philosopher needs to answer this question. Where is the mind in relationship to the body? So if you are a person that believes that there is no God and the whole goal is to reject anything supernatural, so where's the mind?
The frontal lobe.
The frontal lobe. Where's the frontal lobe?
In your head?
In your head, which is where it's in your head.
Your brain.
In your brain. So they would believe that we are completely physical in mentality. We are completely physical beings. There is no supernatural portion to us. So henceforth, our, how would we say this? Our
Being.
soul, our personality and everything is based upon purely our physical body. Now, there has been plenty of studies that have gone, especially into the brain and everything, and neuroscience, that, people have had some massive brain injuries and they've had personality changes, and there's other times where they haven't had those personality changes. Those things have not really been proven to there has been no scientific evidence to distinguish that is the drum set on the other side. I thought it was me hitting the microphone. There's been no scientific evidence linking our personality specifically with the brain. Yes, there has been certain portions where there's like the aggression and different things that have been exasperated if there's certain damages to certain portions of the brain, but there has been no physical like overall correlation between the two. So the problem that secular humanists have had is they have not been able to answer this question. They have not been able to answer the question of what is the difference between the mind and the body. How do you answer that question? How do you answer the question that you could have identical twins? In other words, their DNA is comprised of the same DNA, but yet they have two different personalities. How do you answer that question? And you can't, because you could have identical twins that are nurtured by the same parents, because then comes the question of nature versus nurture. So you could have different people that may grow up in the same sect of people or within the same family, but if they're raised by different parents, okay, maybe that's the situation. But why is it that when they're raised by the same parents, they're given the same upbringing, the same teachings, and the same everything, that they have different personalities? Why is that? If it were all physical, then they should technically have the exact same personality.
They have the exact same DNA.
Identical twins should.
Every gene is inherent.
Yeah,
They're identical.
they're identical. Remember that the identical twin is one egg, fertilized egg became two zygotes. So what ends up happening is the difference than just a fraternal twins, which is two eggs were fertilized. So they are identical from conception. So that is the major problem that secular humanists have. Now, as Christians, there's a lot of holes in this argument because, again, like when we were talking about the whole concept of mind and body, we have a clear answer to that. Well, we have a spiritual part of ourselves and we have a physical part of ourselves. That physical part will die off and then will then be raised up again in the end times and pass through judgment, whether you go to heaven or go to hell. That's the end result of your physical body. The spiritual body, once you pass away, you either go to you get to go with Jesus or in heaven, or you get to go to Sheol, which then we start going into hell and not purgatory. We start talking about the hell and the lake of fire and all this other stuff. Like, when is everything going to happen? Lake of fire is for eternal damnation, where Satan will be cast. He is currently not in hell, ruling hell like a jail. He is literally roaming this earth, as it says in the Bible, in the book of Job.
Why do people have kind of like the idea that the devil will rule hell?
It's because there's a lot of correlations with the god Pan and other deities, lowercase d, lowercase g. that was from historical backings like Hades. He was the one, he was the god of Hades, of hell, and he ruled the underworld. And Pan is a trickster and different things like that. So the correlation of all of these other mythologies has kind of infiltrated the biblical Christianity definition of hell. Most of us think of the devil, we think of this guy with horns and a little pointy tail and maybe some wings and all dressed in black and probably has red skin. But he probably doesn't look like that at all. In fact, he probably looks incredibly beautiful.
So he, bless you.
Bless you. Times
So
6.
He walks in this earth. So is it like a TV show like Lucifer? Is it something like that?
I've never watched the TV show Lucifer, but the way it's described...
I can't watch it, but like the way...
I've never watched it, but in episode 2, minute 36, or whatever. No, but...
No, because like my tutor used to watch it when she was teaching. But anyway, that's not the point. Because like he...
I hope she wasn't charging you for that, but...
No, and there's also this...
Okay, good, go ahead.
So basically like in the commercial you could see like he's just like a normal guy just wearing all black. And then he just...
Basically,
He's
the
wearing a
show
tux.
Lucifer is a man who roams this earth, who is just like, he's able to persuade people and he has a lot of money. And blah, blah, blah.
He's not able to persuade people,
Okay.
but he's able to bring out their deepest desire.
Okay, well,
And persuade.
Is it like that?
two things I've said countless times about Satan and his minions, the demons. First and foremost, Satan was the person in charge of worship of God
Oh, yeah, he's good at music.
in heaven. He was like,
I have never seen it.
he was the most powerful being in all of heaven outside of God. So what happened is the following. He thought, well, I should be God. So he led a rebellion against God and took a third of the angels down with him. Now, the issue that comes up with this is this. Does his appearance change because he fell? No. He was still that angel that fell down. He's just now considered a fallen angel. It's only, again, the mixture of different mythologies that has developed our mindset of him being this pointy-eared, pointy-tailed individual.
I think they made that more of like a
So,
joke.
so the thing is, no, it wasn't made as a joke because, again, those are correct, exact correlations to specific deities in the past. So they actually attributed him and they tried to make this manifestation. Maybe, and what they may have done is more of a allegorical mentality of trying to give a depiction of Jesus. Not Jesus, of Satan. Whereas since he is evil, make him look evil kind of thing. But in reality, he presents himself as the angel of light. He presents himself as an angel of light. And he is also probably the best psychologist. So he knows how to push your buttons and how to make you do what he wants you to do. And probably the best musician. And that's the reason why, and when it comes to music, that is the reason why he uses music. Because there is something about music that makes people's minds go into either trances or even, but believe it or not, there's been scientific evidence of music being able to put people in a transitive state, in putting people in certain moods and different things that based upon the music.
It's like
It
they use
triggers
two tones,
things.
I forget what it's called. It's like bio or I don't know what it is. They use two deep tones to put people in trance.
Yes, but it's not only that, but also
Oh, yeah,
like frequencies and different things like that. But like what there's on top of that is also lyrical methodology of putting people in trances and different things like that. But
like mermaids, like that.
so remember, guys, remember that all of this is being presented live on YouTube. So, so long story short, because we're on a huge tangent right now. Saint tangent means in a bunny trail, or we're going off in a different direction. So long story short, going back to Satan and then going back to the subject, he uses music to sway people away from God. And so that's one reason why, secular music is definitely not the best option for you to be filling your mind with, because it's just filled with garbage. And the way the Bible says is, not the Bible, but, you garbage in, garbage out. So it's just that simple. So that's just one side note that we were just going over. Going back to secular humanism, they cannot disclose the difference between the mind and the body. They can't figure out certain things about the origin of the cosmos. Like we were discussing on Wednesday of last week, second law of thermodynamics. Everything in the universe goes from a lower state of entropy to a higher state of entropy. What does entropy mean? No. I said it last week. I was hoping you guys remember. Not movement. It's a state of disorder. So things go from a lower state of disorder to a higher state of disorder. So in other words, things go from better to worse. Whereas, and that is a law of science. It's not even like a hypothesis. It is an actual law of science that all scientists cling to. But yet, they say that everything in the universe is continuously getting better, which makes absolutely no sense. So that is secular humanism. Now let's move on to, there we go, Marxism, Leninism. And the quote here that we like, if you realize I've been putting quotes for each one of these. Yeah, I know. That's why I'm reiterating it, and I'll read it for you. As long as we actually observe and think, we cannot possibly get away with materialism. The materialist world outlook is simply the conception of nature as it is. So Marxism, Leninists they're an atheist again, so there is no God. Remember, everything that comes down to any debate that you have falls down to one topic and one topic alone. And if you want to become an excellent debater about the Bible and defending your faith, it goes down to one thing. Who is God and what is he to you? Everything about God. Because what happens is this. The moment you make a decision on whom God is and what he is to you, defines every decision you make after that. But there's no decision you make without that preconception. So for a person that says, you know what, I'm kind of agnostic. I believe there's a God out there, but he doesn't really play a part in my life. So I just kind of do whatever I want with no consequences, because he's not really that God that's going to punish me for what I do. Look at how many people are doing bad things and they're not getting punished. There's a lot of people that say that or think that. Or they think they could just push back the grace of God by saying, let me just do whatever I want to do. And then on my deathbed, I would just ask God to forgive me. Unfortunately, not all of us have the opportunity to be on our deathbed. Unfortunately, some of us may meet our Maker through something that may be instantaneous or may take a long time, maybe like cancer. I don't know. It's different things, different way people die different ways. It's just how it is. But one thing is certain for all of us: we all die. So for a person that believes that mentality of, I believe in God, but he has no role in my life, okay, then the rest of your decisions end up being to something a little bit more free and liberal on your mentality of morality. For a person that believes there's no God, so there's no God, so that means there's no creator. That means that we have to then start figuring out, what are we? Because if we believe that there's a God and that he has no role in our lives, we may believe that we have a soul. But if there's no God and there's no supernatural, then what do? Where's our soul? So all of these things always boils down to that simple question. Yes, Giancarlos?
Are there not people who believe, there's no God? No, this is a dumb question the way I said it. Are there people who believe that there is no God, but there are gods? So they don't believe it's one God may redeem me while the other may not, or it doesn't really matter because they don't all cumulatively agree, so they don't care about me.
That is the all roads lead to heaven kind of mentality. There's even people within the Christian church, I will quote unquote, that believe that You know what I mean? As long as you believe in a God, as long as it's just one God, you'll get to heaven. You know what I mean? There's people that believe that. I've had arguments with people that believe that. But you also have the polytheistic and the pantheistic religions that we're not studying any polytheistic religions because most of them are older religions, but we are studying one pantheistic religion, which is cosmic humanism, where all roads lead to God. So it's really a balance of who you are as a person. As long as you find that middle beaten path, you can hit nirvana, and then you'll be able to be oneness with God. So that will be more closely related to what you were just describing there, where any God or anything, they actually believe that all religions end up getting you to heaven or to nirvana.
Is that the coexisting?
No, the coexist will be more of... Coexist is more of a religion that does believe that all religions get to God, but they're more of like combining like religions. So combining more of the monotheistic religions together. So anybody else? I saw that somebody else had her hand up. Any other questions? All right. So remember, with Marxists and Leninists, they actually approach... So the secular humanists approached this mentality from a scientific mindset. They said, there is no God. We have to prove it through science. Marxists and Leninists were more of the philosophical minds. They were like, there is no God because there is another problem that has to be dealt with, and all of history runs through this one mentality, and that is dialectic materialism. Dialectic materialism is, first of all, based upon the objective reality of everything has to be objective, so it has to be something that we could observe. Reality, an objective reality, and the objectivity comes from science. They adopt science as a way of proving their philosophical stance and their theological stance of theology, instead of the secular humanist mentality of they use science as the foundation to then further prove their theological beliefs, whereas Marxist Leninists, they just came up with this idea, there is no God, so we need to find as many things that prove our beliefs. So it's kind of more of a afterthought. So they're not really too big on science. They're more on the philosophical mindset, and we're going to really see that in the next couple points here. So their thought process, there is no God, so anything that proves the lack of the supernatural is what we need to adhere to. So obviously evolution is one of those, and different things like that. So they definitely cling on to that. But here's where we have the dialectic mentality, first of all. Dialectic is a theory that was developed that is that there is a thesis, then there's an antithesis, which are in war with each other. And whatever happens after that battle develops a synthesis. Or put in layman's terms, there's a problem, there's a reaction, there's the solution. Which then, guess what? That solution then becomes the new problem, which comes with another reaction, which then develops another solution. So the way that they view philosophy, especially when we're looking at biblical Christianity, remember the word ontology, ontology, cosmology, metaphysics, the origin of the universe and everything else like that. They try to stray away from that because they really don't focus on that as much. So what they really do is they view all of those theories as the old theses. So they believe that God was a necessary part of history, but now we have evolved past that, and we're now moving on to the next thesis, and therefore there will be another problem. Right now, the big problem is there's the rich, there's the poor. They're at war with each other. The rich exploit the poor are the slave. They need to overthrow any type of authority possible, overthrow the government, overthrow any type of boss relationship or anything else like that, and everything has to be equal. But when they finally come to that solution, when the proletariat overthrow the bourgeoisie, which is the lower class, overthrows the upper class, then the proletariat, the lower class, will then have another problem, because they will be the problem, which will then have its own reaction, which will then come out to another solution. So all of history is just these cyclical processes of problem, reaction, solution. That solution becomes a new problem. New reaction comes up, is at enmity with that problem, and then develops a new solution. And then that solution will become, and it's just cyclical. Everything in history revolves around that. Any questions so far? All right. So the last one we're going to look over is postmodernism. This one's going to be the longer one because this one I feel like is the one that's most relatable to our generation, especially you guys. So here we see the quote is, "We should give up the correspondence theory of truth and start treating moral and scientific beliefs as tools for achieving greater human happiness rather than the representation of the intrinsic nature of reality." This was quoted by Richard Rorty. There's a lot of points here. So the major thing... Oh. Okay. So the original thing that we have here is that...
It's not full screen.
Oh, I thought it was going to go through. All right. I'll go over it. First of all, there's these two concepts in postmodernism: deconstructionalism and anti-realism. The first thing that we want to look at is everything that is true is community-driven. In other words, if the group views that this is a truth, that means that truth is reality. So if we all come together and we say, you know what, this color right here, this black, is not black, it's gray. And we all, this color is red. Let's just say it's red, so it's something really different. And we all come to agreement that it's in red. Because we all have all come to agreement that it is red, that is no longer black, that is red. There is no truth. Now that sounds completely and utterly absurd. But this is how they view all of philosophy. There's no big T truths. There's only small t truths. What do I mean by that? Is that truths become more relative according to the cultural and linguistical subset that it is found. I feel like you have a question, Giancarlos.
Wouldn't that have been like more applicable maybe when we started things off?
What do you mean?
Because we could have named black red, but like nowadays,
No, it's more of like, in the beginning we thought like homosexuality was like something that wasn't common. It was like,
Oh, so
oh my
you mean
gosh,
like-
we can't do that.
I'm
Now
giving
it's
this-
getting more common. We're like, come on now, we have to let that be
So
legal.
not physical, but like mindset.
The truth
Anything.
can change based on the
Anything.
time.
Oh, that.
Anything. Everything's up for grabs.
It's true.
But that is a more applicable explanation of that. I use...
reasonable in quote unquote like what
The reason why I use the black with red is because that's just to show you
how absurd it is.
how, not absurd,
absurd.
but how the concept is related. Because then we start going into, well, with, different moral issues, we start to discuss different things. Such as, now let's look at an applicable issue. Is a baby a living being at conception or at birth? So that is the question. So right now, the general consensus, especially according to the Supreme Court, in which 5, I believe, out of the 4 Supreme Court justices voted, that a baby is not a living being until they are born, which is what gave grounds to partial birth abortion and different things like that to become almost legalized in most of the states, and then it's been dialing back a little bit, because now the concept is now life is a baby is a living being when they can live and sustain their own life. In other words, if you take them out of the womb and they can survive, that means that they are a living being.
How early is that? How early is that legal?
Up to 3, I think it's like up to the second trimester, so 6 months.
Oh, 6 months.
Yeah. So it depends on if they have full lungs and different things like that. So in other words, if the baby survives outside of the womb after birth, they can be considered alive. But God says that he created you and knit you together in your mother's womb. God said that from before you were put together in your mother's womb, he knew you. So conception for us is the start of life. But again, with deconstructionalism and anti-realism, that is up for grabs. Because if the consensus believes that, well, at that point, you can go ahead and kill them off because they're not a living being. We've just removed the identity of a human being from that person and said now they're just literally, as they like to quote it, a cancerous cell group in the body, a tumor. That's really what they say. It's just a clump of cells in your body because it's not viable for life. That is what happens with postmodernism. Any questions so far on that? All right. So the second thing is, and I'm going to have to read this on this because even on my screen is even smaller than this, incredulity towards the meta-narrative. Okay? Incredulity means the opposition, the rejection, and of, therefore, meta-narrative. Meta-narrative means any absolute truth. So literally, postmodernism has an entire war against anything that is absolute. The only absolute for a postmodernist is that there is no absolutes. So, like, everything's relative. So for a person, like, let's say, for God so loved the world that he gave his one only son, that whomsoever believeth in him shall not perish and have everlasting life, they will have a problem with that because, first of all, there's a God. So there's an absolute creator of this universe and supreme being. Second of all, they have a problem with that because the concept of the world. God loved the entire world? That's impossible. There's no absolute world. That is how absurd it becomes. But in reality, this is something that thousands and millions of people believe in. And this is the major, outside of Marxism, Leninism, because Marxism, Leninism has its sect that has infiltrated the church. That will be like liberation theology. That those churches that are talking about always like we are the oppressed and we need to rise up against the oppressor. You know, one of the major proponents of that became very famous in 2006 was Reverend Wright. He was the African-American pastor that was like saying quotes like, not God bless America, God damn America. Why? Because America is an oppressive nation that has survived off the backs of slaves, and we need reparation immediately, and we need to overthrow this white trash basically mentality, and we need to overcome our oppressors from the pulpit. That the Bible teaches these things. The Bible doesn't teach these things. In fact, if anything, the Bible tells us to respect our leaders, to always remember that we are under a position of leadership and we must always honor and work diligently under our masters. So whether it be the President of the United States or, your boss, you have to honor anyone that is above you. And we must always live like that. For crying out loud, look at Joseph's life. It was the epitome of just doing your job and honoring God through it. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, went into Potiphar's house, wrongfully accused of raping the woman's the Potiphar's wife, and ended up getting sent to jail, wrongfully accused, ended up serving the masters in the jail, and ended up becoming the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. But it was after him just basically rolling with the situation and just honoring God everywhere he went. Giancarlos.
What do you say to those who have a problem honoring a leader who is not honorable, in the sense of they don't want to do the right thing?
So the leader doesn't want to do the right thing.
So everybody who hates, nowadays, everybody hates Trump.
Okay.
What do you say to those who have the wrong misconception of Trump or who only look at the negative? What do you say to those people?
We still need to. Okay, first and foremost, we need to pray for all of our leaders.
Yeah. 100%.
I've prayed for every president that we've had that I voted for or not voted for, or I would have voted for before I was 18, or not voted for from when I was a young age. Every single one of them. And whether, for all the people that hate Trump right now, there was a lot of people that did not like Barack Obama. Which, for every person that didn't like Barack Obama, there was a lot of people that didn't like George W. Bush. For the same way, there was a lot of people that didn't like Bill Clinton. You're not going to always get the person you want in the Oval Office. But what you can, as a Christian, always assert is the following. God tells us that he is the one that puts people in power and takes them out. Statistically, Donald Trump should have never been in office. Going all the way up to the day of the election. No one believed that was going to happen. I still remember staying up because I was just looking at the numbers and I was like going to my dad. I'm like, I remember looking at it that morning. I go to my dad. I'm like, Dad, 5 states just went from lean blue to toss-ups. And I was like telling my dad, I think Donald Trump's going to win the election. And I was like, so we stayed up. And I remember watching. The funny thing, I was in Tennessee, yeah. No, North Carolina. So I was watching the elections, and we stayed up till the moment that everyone announced that he was president. So it's like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And can you check who's at the door? So.
Oh God, it's Angie.
So, I was looking at all of that, and I was examining it. And so I was like looking, and I would see how the commentators in certain news stations would like literally go from ecstatic thinking that one person was going to win to like almost literally crying and having nervous breakdowns by the end of the night. And then other people that were having nervous breakdowns at the beginning of the night and going through, and you see them becoming ecstatic. It doesn't matter who's in office. We have to always honor whoever's in office. Does that mean that we have to agree with everything that they do? Absolutely not.
No. So what you're going is being respectful towards them.
Respectful, first of all. Second of all, nothing that they tell you to do should ever compromise your beliefs and what you stand for in Christ.
Yeah.
So just because the United States believes that homosexuality is legal and right does not mean that we should accept that.
So if a non-honorable, according to Christian standards, if a non-honorable authoritative person comes up to you and asks you to do something unhonorably, you have to respectfully decline.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Like if the
So it's not asking you to do whatever they say. It's
Yeah.
respectfully decline.
perfect example is the cake. The people that made the bakers in like what was it, Washington? I forget now what state it was because there was a couple of them.
Seattle.
Yeah, it was Seattle. That literally there was a bakery across the street. But this homosexual company demanded that this openly Christian bakers make them a cake. End result was they refused to do so, which then they were fined. They had to close up their doors. And they lost their entire business.
I thought they won the lawsuit.
Yeah, but they
At the end,
They got fined.
after years, which you know how the legal process is, it takes forever. It just recently got decided upon by the Supreme Court
But they already lost it.
that they were right for not doing so because no one could force them to make the cake. But they've lost everything in the process.
Like protesting in the front
Yeah.
of their business.
Yeah, no, it was horrible. Like the whole situation was horrible. But this is what happens with that, especially with postmodernists. Let's start looking at this, and nothing is absolute except for there's no absolutes. So anybody has an absolute thought process is immediately rejected, and their belief can no longer be considered true. The only people's truth that can be considered true is those that are willing to accept that there is no absolutes. Samantha.
You need to do what whoever's above you. You need to do it. Even like if it's wrong, you just decline.
Right,
And if it's just normal, you just do it.
Well, yeah. Okay, so we're going with the cake situation, the bakers. They refuse to do so. They continue to refuse to do so. They end up paying the fine.
That's okay.
That is perfectly fine because they are not. We are above the law of the land. We're held to the law of God, to the law of Christ, as we learned in Galatians. That the law of Christ is love your neighbor as yourself and all these other things, which has its foundations, yes, on love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Amongst these things was built all of the law. That's what we saw that Jesus said. But if like a person comes in and says, one child policy in China. So the one child policy in China was because the massive population growth in China, they needed to start literally keeping people from having children. So what would happen is if a husband and wife had more than one child, they would need to kill that second child.
That's been like that for a while.
Well, they stopped it recently because what was happening was negative population growth, which then you were having an exceedingly older population. And then and that was the second one. Now there's more men by a large margin than there are women. So what ends up happening is one of the major things that has developed due to this is prostitution. Because women has now women has developed a situation where there's more women than men.
Are there some Asian places that it's legal?
Absolutely, yes. Macau and different things like that, yes. So, but going to what we were discussing here, that is something that is completely anti-biblical. So you've had some families that are Christians that believe in the sanctity of life and they had their children, and what they end up having to do is either hide the children or try to find a way of having their children survive, or they themselves have been put in prison for keeping the children alive. They stood up for what they believe because they don't believe in murder. So that is another example of, yes, the government may be telling you that you need to fulfill this thing, but it goes against our beliefs. It goes against what God teaches us. It goes against what God's morals are. So henceforth, we cannot be forced to do so. We should not be able to. But yes, like you were mentioning, an authoritative government may come into power that may force us to do these things. And we need to stand up to that and make sure that we do the right thing. Any other questions on that? All right. So going down there's a lot of points here. Postmodernists, they have the mark of a postmodernist condition of knowledge as they move away from the authority of universal science towards the narrative of local knowledge. This is, again, going back to what we were just discussing, that the absolute truth is thrown away, so there's no global truth. So if we're in a society that believes that, once a year, murder should be allowed, to be able to help population growth issues and different things like that, and we have like a purge mentality, you know what? That's fine. Murder is okay. As long as the consensus is okay with it. But if the consensus is not in agreement with that, then no, we can't do that. The only law that they have is that the consensus has to be believing what that is. So they throw away the concept that murder is evil. Now, we already know that it's the case, especially when we start looking at these things. Murder is evil. We've been literally in this discussion with abortion, politically, it's been discussed where people have been literally taking babies out that has survived the abortion procedure and let die on the table. That is murder. That is murder.
Did they go to jail?
No, because it's legal still. That's the whole argument that's coming in. So all these things are something that we need to always take into consideration as what is the truth. And the Bible very clearly states, and Jesus states is the following, and I remember in my ENC 1102 class, we were, this is college writing class. Our final test, there's somebody at the door then. Our final exam was write a short essay on this. What is truth? And that's what we were given as our assignment. It was in class assignment. So everyone's writing wrong in their things, and literally you would hear all types of things. And the teacher was trying to push a narrative, stating that, especially as we're going to start reading a little bit further into postmodernism, that truth is relative. Well, my argument was, the Bible says, and Jesus claimed, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father except through me. So I said, based upon that argument, anything that is Jesus related can be counted as truth. And he claimed several different things that are absolute. But the one thing that he did claim to be as well is that he was God. So all the nature of what God is what is truth. So henceforth, God is omnipotent. He is the creator of this universe. He is all love, all wrath, all grace, all mercy. Every attribute of who God is what is truth, and he is the only true embodiment of what truth is. So that is my definition of truth. Of course, I was openly criticized by almost everyone in the room, but the things I heard were completely absurd because we were supposed to prove with evidence. So some people actually used the thought process of, well, you know what? There was a lot of people that were in favor of the Holocaust. They were in favor of putting Jewish people into concentration camps. So henceforth, the Holocaust was a truth. You can kill off the Jews. That is the extreme of what it can be. And is that true? Yes. Believe it or not, there was an anti-Semitism growing in all of Europe prior to the coming of Hitler. Prior to those concentration camps, there was a consensus that Jewish people were evil people and they needed to be killed off and exterminated. So in a large portion of the population, not the majority, but in a large portion of the population, they had no problems with concentration camps.
Isn't that kind of like almost anything that's voted for, except, of course, that's immoral?
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely. But then we're not trying to talk about anything that's voted for does not have to technically.
No, you know what I mean. Like in the retrospect, it's you know.
Yes, I think they just unplugged the network over there.
How do you do that?
Because the Wi-Fi's in there.
Bills.
So that is the thing that's important. So postmodernists reject the notion of a universal, rational reason is always situated within particular narratives, traditions, institutions, and practices. Postmodernists reject unifying, totalizing, universal schemes in favor of new emphasis on difference, plurality, fragmentation, and complexity. In other words, nothing is, again, going back to that same concept, nothing is universal. There is no universal scheme. It's all individual things that's based upon cultures, based upon races, based upon religions, based upon your upbringing, based upon population groups and language. Everything is based upon the plural consensus. Postmodernists reject the notion that a person is an autonomous individual with a rational conscience that transcends his or her particular place in culture, language, history, and gendered body. In other words, you can't think for yourself. The only thing that makes sense is the society. The society determines morality. The society determines everything about whom you are. You have no capacity of thinking individualistically. That is the ultimate consensus of a postmodernist. Postmodernist agrees with Nietzsche that God, that is to say the supreme being of classical theism, has become unbelievable, as has autonomous self and meaning of history. Now remember, postmodernism finds its foundation on Marxism, Leninism, communism. It is the ugly stepbrother of communism. Because what happened was communism had such a failure rate in every culture that it was implemented in that something had to be changed and addressed to this whole, again, going back to communism and Marxism, Leninism. They have a thesis that has this antithesis, which then fights with each other and becomes a synthesis. So communism was an idea. That was the thesis. It came about against its antithesis, which is capitalism and the Western thought process, which those collided with each other, and they ended up losing the battle, which ended up coming into the synthesis. Now, Marxism and Leninism is still very prominent and very strong still today as a philosophical mindset, but what ended up developing from that synthesis was postmodernism. Postmodernism is that's why there is no individualism. It's all about the population. It's all about the consensus of the group. There's no more, as it says here, there's no autonomy. There's no availability of us being able to do what we want to do. It's what the society tells us we should do. So that's why it's got a lot of similarities to Marxism, Leninism. And this is where we start talking about language. What we know about things is linguistically, culturally, and socially constructed. Language stands for the socially constructed order within which we think and move and have our being. In other words, everything comes down to language. And this is where this deconstructionalism and anti-realism combine forces. And this is where we actually have the philosophy of postmodernism. Since there is no absolute truth, that means everything is open to interpretation. So you could have a person that writes a book that clearly states in the book that they're not racist and shows evidence of how they are not racist in their book. But somebody reads that book and feels a racial tone in that book and says, this author's racist. Now, no one can ever confront that person stating that they're wrong. Because, long story short, there's no absolute truth. The interpretation of anything is open to the reader, no longer the writer.
Sorry, like, it also, like, besides, like, the fact that there's no absolute truth, there's also, like, well, there's many truths, like, that can be your truth and that can be your truth.
The perfect example is, let's agree to disagree. I hate that. I hate that answer too. But that is a perfect example of that. And that's why they are at war with anybody that has absolute truth. Because we can't agree to disagree. Because by doing that, we see ground saying, okay, well, you know what? You believe what you believe. That's okay. We don't think it's okay. Now, we just believe it is a part of the human condition to be at enmity with God and reject everything that is God. That's what the Bible says. But again, we could still show them love. We could still show them the love of God. But that doesn't mean we have to accept what they believe. And this is where that whole acceptance comes into play with the church. And that's why I was saying, a vast majority of the churches, not vast majority, I'm sorry, misspoken there. There's a lot of churches and there's a lot of Christians out there that have postmodernism infiltrating their churches. Churches such as that are fine with homosexuality in the church, are fine with premarital intercourse in the church, fine with people having, parties and getting drunk and different things like that. They have this concept of freedom of liberty. They say, well, I can do whatever I want. You can't judge me for that. Before you take the speck in my eye, take out the plank in your eye. It's a misinterpretation of so many biblical verses that they use to prove this, but they have no foundation biblically. And they have been infiltrated by postmodernism, this lack of absolute truth. And a lot of times, and this is the community thing, is that they will also water down the gospel because they will say the gospel message is too, how would we say it? Not just rough, confrontational, too convicting, too offensive. Yes, the gospel is convicting. Yes, the gospel is offensive. Why? Well, we just went over it. If you have this belief that you don't want anything to do with God and you do whatever it takes to stay away from God, then anybody that tells you otherwise, do you ever like to be told that you're wrong? No one likes to be told they're wrong. No one does. And from what I heard, especially Dan. That's now on YouTube. So, long story short, of course the gospel is offensive. But it's not because it's offensive because we don't care about them. It's offensive because their goal in life is to reject God. That's their goal in life. If you're not a Christian, you're, as the Bible says, you're at enmity with God. you want nothing to do with God. So why would they ever be welcoming to the message? But a lot of these churches will come into play and they say, you know what? Let's just accept them for who they are. Let's just preach a message of just caring for each other and accepting people and do all these things. And then as time goes by, God will find them and they'll come to Christ. But let's not push people away with a message that talks too much about sin and judgment. In fact, there's churches out there that will not mention that at all. It is forbidden to mention that as part of the gospel message. But it's imperative to understand where we stand, talk about sin, our state of being with God, and how to fix that. How can you be saved if you don't know where you come from? How do you know that if you are blind, deaf, mute, and you can't sense any temperature, and you're in a fire, and somebody comes to you, tries to save you, you're going to just basically push them away because you don't feel that you're on fire, that there's fire around you. So how do you know where you stand if God doesn't reveal that to you? And that's how God uses us to present the word of God, for God to then open the door so it can be revealed to them. That's our responsibility. Remember back and I found it so ironic. I'm telling you, Sunday morning, I came in with a completely message prepared. And I opened my Bible and went to something totally different. And ironically, it was the exact same thing my dad preached on. Mm-hmm. Right?
Oh, yeah.
It was like word for word. I thought my dad had a camera in the room.
I thought it was planned.
It was not planned. It was not planned at all. It was not planned at all. Now, I forgot why I was going to say that. But, long story short, our responsibility, and what we were talking about on Sunday, and this is something to show that it was a God thing there. Our responsibilities as Christians is to preach the gospel unadulterated. That is our responsibility. We must stand firm for the truths that we have here. And this is something when we start talking about deconstructionalism, again, you no longer have any authority of what you say. You could say one thing, and if somebody thinks anything else about what you just said, they could have more authority about what you just said than you saying what you just said. So you could say something, mean nothing about it, but somebody took that the wrong way, and just because they felt like that was, let's say, racist or bigotry or different things like that, they can go ahead and say, you know what? You're a racist. And forever now, you are a racist. You're labeled a racist. Why? Because their truth is as equally strong as my truth of what I just said. Even though I could adamantly disprove them and show them all the evidence against what they're teaching, they have their own truth that is a truth. So, as Confucius says, when words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom. When words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom. And that is absolutely true. When there's no longer any meaning behind what we say, and it could just be literally torn apart and thrown into a shredder and be basically given a completely new truth, there's nothing that we can say that changes that. So that is important. Now, one thing I want to talk about when it comes to truths is the following. There are certain truths that we can hold fast to as Christians. God has promised us so much. But something I do want to repeat as well is the following. If you have been saved, and God has saved you from your previous self of being eternally damned because of our sin, saved you from your sin, brought you new life, you have certain promises that have been given to you. The first one has given to everybody. You have been created, and God has knit you together in your mother's womb. You have a purpose. You see, these other worldviews, as we're going to start learning more and more, since there's no God, we've just said another portion of evolution. You have literally no purpose except for breathing, putting your portion in for the process of evolution, and then your cells go back to earth to be able to become dust again, fertilizer. That's it. For pantheists, you have a different purpose. But really, when you think about it, in all the other worldviews, the only person that's important is you. That's it. But with God, God has a specific purpose to use you for his kingdom. You have a purpose. You have been fearfully and wonderfully made. Second thing that you could also learn is that when it comes to absolute truth, you have a God that is there for you always. At the end of Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 through 20, he says, go out and make disciples of all the world, like going to the different portions of the world. Baptize them in the name of the Father and the Holy Spirit. And then Jesus goes, and I will be with you always. You could be at the lowest of lows. You could be persecuted like people are being persecuted currently in North Korea or in Muslim states like in the Middle East. You could be persecuted beyond belief, but God will always be with you, always. Second of all, the third thing that you could also take into advantage, take as a promise, is that once you're saved, you've been saved for your life, which will then come to the fourth point, which is once you're saved, you are now a new creation. The old things have gone away. You can no longer live the way you used to live. And it's not because you're forced to do so, it's just that you're a new creation. So how can a new creation act like the old? It can't. It just cannot. Has anybody ever had an old car and then got a new car?
Yes.
Okay. So does the new car ever act when you get the new car like the old car? No. No. It acts like a new car. The same thing happens with our lives. You are a new creation. This is now in a much more complex level. You are a new creation. You are a new creation. You're no longer anything like the old. But sometimes we still think we're like the old people that we were before. And we must always remember that we are no longer those people.